wear the hat of a panelist briefly and we have to moderate the session. But I want to start first with Mr. Malegam and request your views.
Thank you. Good afternoon. The area of related party transactions is, in my view, a very high-risk area. It's a high risk for the company because if you look at the company failures which have taken place in the last few years, a majority, if not all of them, have been triggered by a diversion of funds by promoters to related parties, to shell companies, and to dubious entities, all of which are in some way connected with promoters or directors and so on. So it's a high risk for the companies. It's an even higher risk for the directors of those companies. And that is because for two reasons. One, the penalties which are formulated in the Act are quite draconian in the sense that the punishment could extend to imprisonment, it could extend to fines, it could result in a person being debarred from being a director of a company for 5 years. And for a more important reason, that the ability of the directors to detect a related party transaction is somewhat limited. He has to rely to a large extent on declarations which are made by other directors, on the mechanism which is there within the company to identify such transactions, and so on. So, therefore, I think it's a high-risk area. Now, I would like to flag 4 issues which we would like to consider. The first is, who is a related party? There are, in fact, 2 definitions of it. There is a definition under the Companies Act, which lists out a number of entities and individuals. But surprisingly, whereas it has this whole list of relations and persons and so on, it doesn't list the entities which are controlled by some of these people. So I may be wrong, but my feeling is that if tomorrow the wife of a director had a private limited company, under the Companies Act, that would not be a related party. And that is clearly a loophole. But under the listing agreement, the provision is that a related party is defined under the Companies Act or as specified in the accounting standards. And the accounting standards definition of a related party is much wider. It includes all entities which are controlled or over which you have a substantial interest or an undue or great influence, which are, and with which the people who are nominated as related parties are involved. So therefore, if you take that definition, you will get a much wider field. Now the question which has to be considered is, what happens if there is an offense by a person or there is a transaction with a related party, which is a related party under the listing agreement, but not a related party under the Act? Then will the penalties which are applicable under the Act be applicable to such a transaction? Or would they only be the penalties which are there in the listing agreement? I think that's one issue which perhaps needs to be flagged. The second issue is that the Act talks of transactions in the normal course of business. There is no definition of what is a transaction in the normal course of business. And there are different views about it. My own view is that when you talk of a transaction in the normal course of business, it must mean a transaction which is part of the normal business of that entity, not a transaction which is incidental to that business. And therefore, if because this distinction is important because of the authorities which can sanction such transactions. But it's also important because the risk to the directors increases when there are terms used in the regulations which are capable of alternate meaning. And if there are value judgments involved, and there are value judgments, the director honestly takes one value judgment and the regulator takes a different value judgment, he could have a serious problem. So that was the second issue which I'd like to flag. The third issue is about what are the regulatory requirements for the approvals. Under the Act, it is provided that if you have a related party transaction which exceeds the limits which are specified, you need a ordinary approval of the shareholders. And it is also specified that in that voting, the related party cannot participate. Now, there was a view taken that all related parties cannot participate, meaning if you have two related parties and one is only involved in this transaction, the other who has nothing to do with the transaction also could not participate. And therefore, which was illogical, and therefore the Companies Act issued a guidance, I think in 2014, saying it's only that related party which is involved in the transaction who cannot participate. And I thought that was a good thing. But unfortunately, the listing agreement has not made that change. So that today, under the listing agreement, all related parties cannot participate in this transaction. Secondly, again, you have a divergence. Under the Companies Act, it says that where you have transactions which are in the nature of reconstruction, amalgamation, acquisition, for which there are separate provisions under the Act, the related party transaction provisions do not apply. The listing agreements do not make this sort of distinction. And the fourth issue which I'd like to flag is that there is a real problem created in respect of companies where the non-promoter holding is very small. Take mainly the case of the MNCs. There are many MNCs where the public shareholding is 25%. Now, if you take that position and say you put the resolution to the postal vote of the shareholders, it's very likely that 50% of the minority shareholders will not vote, which this seems to be the pattern. And probably they don't vote because they have no objection to that transaction. Now, therefore, out of 25%, only 12.5% vote. And if 6.3% vote against the transaction cannot go through. And of the people who vote, you have mutual funds, you have private equity, etc., which have sizable blocks of the shareholding. So to some extent, the whole deal becomes subject to the whims and fancies of a few shareholders who may have a different view on the matter. So I would have thought the more logical view is to say that when someone does not vote for a resolution, he shall be deemed to have voted in favor of the resolution. Because if he did not favor it, he would object to it. So you either have that situation and say in calculating the votes, for those who did not vote, you treat it as a positive vote, or alternatively, that in calculating the votes, the transaction cannot be done if more than 50% of the non-interested shareholders oppose the resolution. But unless this is done, this is creating a major issue. I think these are some of the issues which I'd like to flag at the beginning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Malegam. As usual, very perceptive, very precise, the 4 issues. And I think we'll come back to them in a bit of a discussion. Sorry, I think my voice is better now. I think not he, I seem to have lost my voice. So he was fine, as you can see. Just a few comments before requesting Sanjay to speak. We're looking here at transgressions. And as Mr. Malegam just pointed out, a large part of the problem seem to come from these kind of related party things. And we've got to see where and how these are happening and what can stop them, either in terms of legal aspects that are there, the Companies Act, the listing agreements, or in terms of what role the board needs to play to look at these. And I want to come back in a moment to what role the boards can play, but I think the right person to speak a little more about that is Sanjay, and to give us a perspective of what is it that, from his vantage point, and he sees many, many companies, he sees as the kind of issues, not just in terms of the specific issue of related party transactions, but the broader ambit of what that does to investor confidence and how they perceive this. So Sanjay, over to you to give your perspective on this.
Thank you, Mr. Damodaran, for inviting again. I think your platform has grown really well, and I just hope that, the culture of governance, I just hope there is a increase in it, but from last time when I was here to now, the disturbing trend, I think, has gone down, actually. And obviously, it's disturbing because maybe it's a time when there is a lot of stress in the markets and the economy. There is a bankruptcy code. Defaulters are not spared. These are all good things, by the way. But the behavior and the culture has deteriorated rapidly, and we're seeing this affect us in many ways. And by us, I mean the investor community. Today, India's biggest FDI contribution is coming from foreign investors, whether it's venture capital, it's private equity growth, it's private equity buyout. There is some real FDI, but frankly, this 5-7-year money is today playing a very important role in the economy, both in terms of growth and in terms of capital creation. And my view is that sitting in listed companies with minority stake is actually the toughest situation to be in. Where we have buyouts and we sit with the whole company to ourselves, I think things are much easier to manage. So we should really address the first one, because that is the majority of the capital. How it comes in is it comes in the form of private equity or private credit, either in a company or at a holdco, at the holding company level. And the disturbing trend, I think, is that one thing that what we used to all focus on, related party, was agreements, rentals, properties. I think that's all passé. The big thing now is lending and borrowing to other entities. And somehow it gets missed out. And I don't know the section 188 or 185, but frankly, lending and borrowing to companies where the beneficial ownership might translate back to a director or KMP is not captured. And it is being used, again and again and again. And numbers are growing. And as I said, maybe there are stress for different reasons, because the environment is quite tough, and hopefully we're going to come out better after all this poison. But the fact is that it is hurting investor confidence big time. The structures is not just about going around the sections, but I think that they're becoming very, very creative also. The banks also actually willy-nilly are not involved, but they're not able to detect what's going on, because money is now moving from account A to B to C, also to make sure there's a bit of evergreening going on. So it's not necessarily going for personal, wealth creation, but it's going into companies. And this is really a very, very troubling fact. Structures are getting into situations where subsidiaries are getting created, trusts are getting in the middle, and these are not covered by any of these acts, and you can't detect them. So I think that's a real issue, because when investor money comes in, it is either coming to refinance somebody or is coming in for actual capital expenditure. And we are finding there is quite a massive amount of leakage that's going on. So I think that's really the most disturbing trend right now. And I really wonder why. And I think there is a general deterioration of culture. When private investors come in or private credit comes in, there's an element of trust that one comes with. We used to always say, once you define a document, a lot of us don't ever go back to the document. We always do on mutual trust. I think the trust is breaking down, and that's unfortunate because foreign capital, beyond a point, can never do or expect to do the diligence that you think you can capture everything. A lot of things happen on trust, and you always say you do business with people that you like and trust. You respect them, they respect you. So I think that's one big change that is going on, and I think that's going to, in the long run, make cost of capital higher, make getting money in that much more difficult. And unfortunately, it's not like the local players can do much more because they are anyway more regulated than the foreigners. And they're also hurting, by the way. Mutual funds are hurting, banks are hurting, private NBFCs are hurting. So I think we're staring at an implication of all of this related party transactions, especially as it relates to lending and borrowing to related parties, not captured, not transparent, happening either way below, people are sitting at the top, listed entities, unlisted entities even more so. And I think my real submission is that we could see a slowdown in the FDI from this segment. But I also believe on the positive side, as I said, that I think we will come out of this much stronger. Platforms like this, I just hope there isn't regulation to a new level where nothing happens, but there's some degree of self-governance. Now, I don't know what that is, and that is something we should debate. And I was talking to Mr. Malegam earlier. What self-governance can you bring in? Can you shame the peers in public? No one does that. Can you create bodies again? Self-regulate bodies? I think it's not possible. So I would really love to talk about what can we do to get some degree of self-governance back, because any more regulation, any more forensic diligence is just going to defeat the purpose and slow down what I think is a very valuable form of capital that India needs today.
Thank you, Sanjay. I think you painted a picture that's disturbing. I want to come back to some of the points and maybe talk a little bit about that. Just want to point out one more thing so we open up this discussion to a slightly broader plane. One are the financial kinds of transactions between related parties to which both Mr. Malegam and Sanjay referred to in terms of money and moving it down. Sanjay talked of trusts and other forms which are a little more opaque in terms of laws and what you can do there. But there's also another form which, from the point of view of governance and the boards, one needs to look at, which has become a form that's been used in the past but may be becoming more widespread. And that's a form of, you might say, buying influence through related parties. And the examples of this that come out where the promoter, founder wants something done, and the indirect method is to get a key person's son, daughter, daughter-in-law, wife on the board. And we talked earlier about board compensations. Board compensation not terribly high in India, but some of them are reasonably high. And is this a way of a related party in an indirect sense getting affected? And this has more to do with the ethics and integrity, and to a limited extent cash transfers. And how do you deal with these kinds of issues is something else that I think boards will have to grapple with more than the law. But that may be something else we may want to touch on if we have time beyond the immediate related party formal, legal and technical aspects. Sanjay spoke of a very important part, which is also a big theme of the morning discussion, on the trust part of it. And I do want to recall, Sanjay, to what you're saying, that some years back, the CEO of one of the biggest tech companies in the world mentioned to me that he and his company prefer to invest in India compared to China and a few other countries because the trust level here is higher. And what you're saying is certainly disturbing, because the trust level, if it erodes, and you're so right, because everybody knows this, that sadly, especially in India, you write an agreement, and the only way to handle that if something goes wrong is to go to courts, which means your children might get some benefit or may not, but you never see that. So given the logjam in our judicial system in general, companies, investors do operate a great deal on trust. You put in an agreement which takes care of all the legal aspects and hope it works, but ultimately it's the trust in that. And I think if that trust is eroding, I think it's a cause for very, very serious concern and what we need to do on that. The one aspect I do want to touch on, and Mr. Malegam, you touched on this, and like your response to some of this, you pointed out the 4 major issues that are there, and how some of them relate to differing laws in terms of not being harmonized between the listing agreements and the Companies Act. Now, is there a way of bringing in some degree of harmony to make sure that there are well-defined, very clear guidelines and things for related party transactions, which will help not just the legal part, but help boards to be able to handle and straddle this thing? Otherwise, boards are a bit caught up, particularly independent directors who are looking at related party transactions, and the 2 differing kinds of things. Which one do they go by? And especially the 2, as on occasion, and you would be the best one to confirm if this is so, are not in direct conflict, but are not quite at par. They don't quite overlap. So how do you deal with this? What is the method of going forward in this area?
Well, I think first is the general proposition. The general proposition is that the Companies Act applies to all companies. The SEBI regulations apply to listed companies. And traditionally, SEBI regulations were supposed to be more stringent because the risks involved to the listed companies were greater. There was a larger public interest involved and so on. So if there is any difference between what the listing regulation says and the Act says, that difference should be restricted to areas where you want to make something more stringent. It should not be a difference on the basic fact itself. You don't define the same term in 2 different ways. You must have a reason why a SEBI regulation or a listing regulation is different, and you say it's different because we want to make a regulation stricter insofar as that is concerned. There's one other thought which I have. You said, how do we resolve this? I think the general proposition I'd like to make is that any time you have a regulation which is meant to discipline people, it should be specifically directed to the wrongdoer. It should not cover people who had nothing to do with it. So therefore, even if you have a regulation which says that if a company breaches the related party transaction, every director of that company is liable, it doesn't make sense. It should be a regulation which says the director who was responsible for that violation should be punished. Now, if you extend that further in the area of related party transactions, it means that first you must have knowledge that there is a related party transaction. And the only person who can provide that knowledge is the director who is a related party. No one else can provide that knowledge, and you cannot expect someone else to provide that knowledge. So therefore, I think we should restrict it to that direction. The second point is, ask for knowledge which can be within the competence of that individual. If you ask me what my wife is doing in terms of a business, I would be willing to say, yes, I know what business she's doing. If you ask me whether my brother has an interest in some shares, I don't know that. How can you expect me to therefore disclose the fact that my brother has shares in some other company? The regulator doesn't seem to take this factor into account. So that is a second issue which we need to address.
I think this question on that, Mr. Malegam. Sorry, so just a quick question. I'll come back to your question. To your point on this, which is a valid thing. Every time I fill these forms, I have the same kinds of problems. How do I know of somebody, a brother who's sitting in the US for the last 30 years, or a sister who's there for 40 years, what shares they might own in India and declare them and related parties and other things. How do these regulations come about? You've got regulators who are quite sensible and sane. We have a brilliant example right here. So where do these come from and what happens?
Kiran, it's there in the Companies Act. In the Companies Act, every director is required to disclose particulars about members of his relation.
I know, but where does this idea come from?
And when I have to disclose, I say that I don't know. How can I disclose facts which are not within my knowledge? and which I cannot compel someone to disclose to me. So this is the first point, that the regulator has to take a practical view of the matter. That's the whole point.
We come back to regulators. Sanjay, sorry, you had a
No,
question.
I was just picking up the point of trust because I left a vague word called trust out there. But this is exactly the kind of stuff that you trust when you put money, that he will disclose the person who is in know of if my brother's wife is holding certain shares. If you don't know, you don't know, and you discover it 2-3 years later. That's the point I meant by trust. You know, how transparent are people? Because you depend a lot upon what people tell you. So I was just adding to the point of trust.
That's quite a point. But, you know, in your experience, Sanjay, is this a method that's really disturbing in terms of the related party transactions specifically, in terms of money going in and then finding its way elsewhere? Is that something you've actually seen?
Look, I mean, as I said, that trend is increasing. And I think as I said, we were traditionally all focused on commercial agreements and commercial arrangements and trying to put that in the public and putting that on the litmus test. Is it arm's length? Is it this? Is it that? But this whole borrowing and lending to related party vehicles has just become a new and a very big area. And I think we've always talked about, you know, what happened 8-10 years ago with the healthcare business of a famous group. But I think what that started as a trend and what's going on is that has become kind of the new trend we are finding. So I think borrowing and lending is something that we will have to look at very carefully going forward. And if it's happening in subsidiaries or it's happening in entities and they're not captured under the RPT, I think you can miss it completely. There's a lot of leakage that can happen through that mechanism.
Yeah, but as far as the lending institutions are concerned.
No, lending or borrowing to related parties from your company.
No, but what I'm trying to say, when you are lending and borrowing to relate, are you talking of financial institutions?
No.
Which are lending to those entities?
No. Your company in which you are invested has got subsidiaries and you're lending and borrowing from those.
Because what happens is that in many of these cases where failures have taken place, the people holding the baby have ultimately been the financial institutions.
Sure, because if the cash is gone.
And the financial institutions have not been aware of the fact that there has been a diversion of funds to related parties. And forgive my saying so, but I think perhaps one of the problems is that financial institutions have not built up sufficient market intelligence units. They do not have within themselves specific units which go out into the market, collect market gossip, because many of these things are known to outsiders.
Yeah.
That is one. But as a general proposition, I think there's one other thing which we should consider. If you just have provisions which says you will obtain approvals, etc., then you have problems in terms of implementing them. If you have provisions which says you give disclosures, and the way in which disclosures are given today, if you see the annual accounts, you will get a schedule where they will say X amount of money in terms of transactions given to various entities. That is not the answer. I think the answer is that you have limited disclosure of material related party transactions. And if that disclosure is made available, if there is, sunlight is the best cure for many evils.
Yes.
And if somehow we have more of pointed material disclosures and less of general disclosures, then by itself the fear of disclosure would be a good deterrent to this sort of transactions.
But to this, Mr. Malegam, and your earlier point about the person who knows best is the person who does that, the director or whoever. Yeah. What's the role of auditors in this? Do they have something which they can do?
Well,
or should
as
do?
I said, the auditors are perhaps in the same position as any other director.
They wouldn't.
The auditors will rely upon a declaration made by a director that there is a related party. They will rely upon the minutes of the audit committee which says that these are the related party transactions which has been seen by that. And then they will apply their mind to see whether those are on arm's length basis.
Yes.
The primary responsibility for disclosure is on the person who is involved.
No, that's correct. But if there are large transactions.
And then I think, but the only thing the directors can do is to perhaps see that the company has a robust method by which it tracks all related party transactions, brings it to both the audit committee, and sees that the audit committee applies its mind to it.
That was precisely my question. Can the auditor play that role?
If that robust procedure should be there, he can only see that that procedure, that system is legislated. That's how.
But I think just the way you said that the banks and financial institutions should really up the game in terms of being smarter, I agree with you fully. They have to, in fact, in the opening remarks I said that banks have also been sort of not sleeping at the wheel, but not been as attentive to what's going on. I think the auditors also need to up the technical game as to how to look at the quarter ends and the year ends and you know, movements of cash. I think it's very, very critical. You just can't take everything on the basis of a certificate or whatever. So I think everybody has to up the game. But all that I'm saying is that with everybody upping the game, and if you're losing trust and you don't have adequate disclosures, it's going to become that much more difficult to get capital.
Sanjay, to this, you know, in the morning we discussed a little bit about technology. Are you seeing this actually being used in terms of technology being used to understand some of these data analytics, for example, to understand some of the transactions? Are they using it to throw up these kinds of related party transactions in some way in any companies? Actually on the ground, I mean, in theory, you can talk about it. Are you actually seeing something happening?
No, we haven't seen much of that. I mean, we probably will start thinking about that, but we haven't done much of that. We haven't seen much. Maybe in companies that have very diversified operations or multiple bank accounts or a lot of B2C transactions, maybe they're doing that. In our experience, we haven't done, but I think you will have to start using technology to a much greater extent. You'll have to have much more integration with the banks, where the accounts are. So I think a lot of that will begin to happen now.
Are you seeing that, Mr. Malegam? Are the auditors much more aggressive in using technology for determining some of these things to just throw up red flags?
Yes, I think auditors are now using much more of technology but where they're using the technology is that in the past, in the absence of technology, you had a mass of transactions. You did a test check of some transactions for the purpose of determining whether rules were being followed, etc., and so on, whether the internal controls were operating. Now technology, like data analytics, permits you to look at the whole gamut of transactions. So virtually with that technology, now you are not doing a test check. You're looking at the total database. And from that database, using this data analytics, blockchain, and various other techniques, you are able to identify those transactions which need a more detailed scrutiny.
Yes.
But the starting point, of course, is that the database itself does not contain that document or that information.
I think, no, I think that's a fair point. But I think the larger issue is that if you can't trust a balance sheet, okay, and balance sheet is at a point in time, I agree data analytics can help if you're looking at a continuum of data or a continuum of time series of data. But because balance sheets are at a point in time, and if you can't trust the balance sheet numbers, I think it's a different kind of problem.
No. Well, I wouldn't say you can't trust them.
You can trust them. I'm not saying that. I don't mean that. I'm saying if the balance sheet was a point in time, you've got to make sure that those numbers are perfect. That's the point.
No, but to your point, Sanjay, and Mr. Malegam also said this, I think much of what technology is being used for today, and hope I'm wrong, by auditors, and auditors here may take offense, is really automation of existing processes.
That's right.
It's not really getting, to what you're saying, and Mr. Malegam said, what is disclosed to them, but the fact is the auditor can look at every transaction, can in theory, I know it's impossible. But with data analytics and automation, they can look at every transaction. So why is it that nobody else needs to tell them? If there are ways of doing this, again I say in theory, but it is not impossible for technology to be able to throw up related party transactions.
No, Kiran, the point I'm making is you can look at a transaction.
Yes.
You can see whether the transaction makes sense. It's in the normal course of business. but you will not be able to find
related
out
parties.
that that transaction is with a related party unless that related party has disclosed the fact that it's a related party.
Would end on an optimistic note, saying there are problems, but it's more to do with more disclosures, more finding out. In the sense it's positive. Mr. Malegam certainly has said that the vendors have far greater responsibility. I agree with him. They have the wherewithal, they have the tools, they have the people. They should be far more proactive than they have been. And if they do that, given that we are seeing much more things coming out, the corporate governance standards have been well laid down and improving, and I'm very optimistic that we will see this moving forward, and this whole business of working through related parties to siphon off things will decrease and disappear altogether. That's a dream, but we'll at least minimize in the future. So with that, let me end this session saying we've been optimistic and we look forward to much better standards in this area, and all of you can help in that whole exercise. Thank you.